Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, members of the subcommittee. I am honored to appear before you today to participate in this timely and critically important hearing regarding U.S. restrictions on travel to and trade with Cuba. Human Rights Watch has been reporting on the human rights situation in Cuba for more than 2 decades. Cuba remains the one country in this hemisphere that systematically represses virtually all forms of political dissent. In July 2006, Fidel Castro handed over control of the Cuban government to his brother Raúl Castro. Rather than dismantle Cuba's repressive machinery, Raúl Castro has kept it firmly in place and fully active. Scores of political prisoners arrested under Fidel Castro continue to languish in Cuban prisons, and Raúl Castro's government has used draconian laws and sham trials to incarcerate scores more. The Cuban governments are relying in particular on a dangerous provision in the criminal code that allows the state to imprison individuals before they have committed a crime on the suspicion that they might commit an offense in the future. This Orwellian law captures the essence of the Cuban government's repressive mindset, which views anyone who acts out of step with the government as a potential threat and thus worthy of punishment. Human rights defenders, journalists, and other civil society members are persecuted with systematic due process violations, including abusive interrogations without legal counsel. Political prisoners are subjected to widespread abuses, including forced ideological re-education, prolonged solitary confinement, and the denial of medical treatment for serious illness. If efforts by the U.S. government to press for change in Cuba by imposing a sweeping ban on trade and travel have proven to be a costly and misguided failure. The embargo imposes indiscriminate hardship on the Cuban population as a whole. And as the research of Human Rights Watch shows, it has done nothing to improve the situation of human rights in Cuba. Rather than isolating Cuba, the policy has isolated the United States, enabling the Castro government to garner sympathy abroad while simultaneously alienating Washington's potential allies. There is no question the Cuban government bears full and exclusive responsibility for the abuses it commits. However, so long as the embargo remains in place, the Castro government will continue to manipulate U.S. policy to cast itself as a Latin American David standing up to a U.S. Goliath. Ending the travel ban and removing obstacles to agricultural trade are steps in the right direction toward reforming this ineffective policy. Therefore, we fully support the Travel Restriction Reform and Export Enhancement Act. We believe the proposed legislation represents the most comprehensive effort to date to overhaul a U.S. policy that has failed for decades to have any impact on improving human rights in Cuba. Nonetheless, Human Rights Watch does not believe that legislation lifting the travel ban and removing obstacles to agricultural trade with Cuba will, by itself, bring an end to repression by the Cuban government. Such an expectation is unrealistic. Even in the face of such a significant shift in U.S. policy, we should expect the Cuban government to continue to deny its people their fundamental freedoms. However, that is not a justification for keeping a failed policy in place. Rather, the United States should replace its unilateral approach focused on regime change with a multilateral approach focused on human rights. This move would fundamentally shift the balance in the Cuban government's relationship with its own people and the international community, and will place more effective pressure on the Castro government. No longer would Cuba be able to manipulate the embargo as a pretext for its repression or an excuse for its problems. Nor would other countries be able to blame the U.S. policy for their own failures to hold Cuba accountable for its abuses. In sum, nothing will be more threatening to the Castro's half-century monopoly on power than a coalition of countries, including the United States, adopting a shared strategy focused on promoting human rights in Cuba. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I thank you very much for the opportunity to appear before you today. Thanks.